Okay. Hello. On this first episode of Painterly Conversations, we will be painting a lovely, strange Guess suitcase bag that was gifted to me by my friend Mary Francis, who's a wonderful person and didn't want this bag, but it's kind of ugly, and I love how ugly it is, but nonetheless, we will be ruining it. And while we are ruining it, we will be discussing a strange text that I think everyone should know about called the Gospel of Thomas. And usually when I bring up this text to people, it's kind of strange. They assume I mean to talk about the Bible, when in fact the most interesting thing about the text is that it is not in the Bible, and that it is a non-canonical piece of Christian literature. And I say literature because I mean to really talk about it philologically. I was raised extremely Christian, but I still have a bit of confusion about the overarching metaphysical notion of it as a belief system. And I think that this text, however, helps explain that. For your ears, we have the nice tendril whatevers of Carlos Pizarro, which is a strange record I found, and I don't think anyone will care about copyright claims, so I didn't want to paint in silence. Now, to the Gospel of Thomas. I suppose it's first necessary for me to talk about my relationship to Christianity. I was raised in Georgia and went to what might be regarded as a mega church called Mount Bethel. And I very much internalized the Christian metaphysics as real as a boy. Like, as real as it could be. I know everybody, I don't know. I suppose there's two different ways you could epistemically attach to Christianity. And one is, like, the notion of faith, right? Where there really can't be any doubt from the get-go. And that's the whole point. But sorry, some of this does take a bit of delicate timing. I only really like enamel paint. Where was I? Golly gee. I think it's hard not to be raised Protestant in the South. I mean, I had a Southern mom. So there's a level of performatism that was required of me socially and, like, for my family to present as a Christian. I'm sure tons of American people have this same thing. But, I mean, like, no one really tells you as a boy or as a child, I mean, what is real, what metaphysically, or as in a theory of reality, what really is going on in the world. But they give you one story. It's kind of impossible not to accept that story is completely true. And, I mean, I did. But the more you get old, you read the Bible, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I don't mean, like, from a standpoint of, like, oh, obviously, I mean, you read the book of Timothy and the way that it talks about women is disgusting, or you start actually wondering, like, these laws in Leviticus about not eating pork and not fucking men, not having sex with men, how real are they? And nobody really knows. But I just meant literally, like, in terms of logical inconsistencies. There's too many things in the Bible that seem to disagree with themselves. And the wisest Christians will chalk this up to, you know, kind of divine wisdom. But nonetheless, I mean, if God can't clarify himself, how much of a God could he be? I was fixated on the Tower of Babel story as a child, which I think is one that Jews are usually more familiar with than Christians. And if you don't know, basically in the early whatever Christian world, Jewish world, people tried to construct like the largest tower. They got really good at architecture, and they're like, we're basically God now. We can construct a tower to heaven. And they try to, and as a result, God punishes them by making language. Like, there wasn't foreign languages before people tried to spite God by architecturally creating a super phallus. I think that's kind of silly, but very telling, because really there isn't a casual Christian answer besides that for why we have language and like linguistic separation. But you know, this is just one of those things that didn't get answered. And as you get older, the words of actually eloquent, brilliant men, while they might have their problems, like the existentialists, for example, or, I don't know, Nietzsche is especially seductive to young men for some reason. They start to sound a bit more like reality. And I think this has to do with a larger history of canonization. That's really my main point to talk about the Gospel of Thomas. That there probably is a lot of truth in the historical religious figure of Jesus and in like whatever Christianity probably was to people in the early days. I think is just very detached from what it's become. And I think the Gospel of Thomas is kind of a key into that. I don't think I'm alone in believing that. There's a whole bunch of internet wackadoo bullshit about this, though, that I do not mean to add to. My background is in vague amounts of philosophy. It is not in philology, it is not in archaeology, and it is certainly not in theology. But I do think that my reading of the Gospel of Thomas has led me to a number of realizations about my relationship to Christianity that at least I find interesting. And I think this is something that a lot of people want to hear about lately. So we'll go ahead. I started this by doing an exhaustive reading of the parables in the Bible. Because to me it's odd that the Bible functionally just tells the same stories over and over and over again. Like, there's not that many actual stories in the Bible, and every single gospel is just kind of reiterating the same ones. And to me, that's telling that obviously there might be it's important to view the Bible as a kind of a propaganda, because at the start of any religion, they're trying to convert people. And especially in the later writings of the New Testament, like in the writings of Paul, it's like you can't read it and not just see it as a kind of propaganda trying to basically blend Greek and Aramaic cultures into a sort of a political union. It's hard to describe it as not a political union. I'm sorry, I keep getting a little sidetracked. This is tricky to do both at once. I suppose I'll get better at it over time. But I think there's an economic history that is hidden. That is why I am specifically interested, because I don't really think there's any need to scholarly invest any time in something that isn't directly about greed's relationship to the actual death of the natural world, which just so happens to be what Christianity truly implies in its eschatology. And for those who don't know, an eschatology is just a study of the end of times. It comes from the Greek for the end, eschaton. So it really just means like an apocalypse more than anything. But a lot of people have described Jesus as primarily an eschatological preacher. And I think it might be better to describe him as primarily an economic theorist. I think if you look through the parables, which again was why I started doing this in the first place, they're all about minor economic not all of them, but for the most part, like, they're not metaphysical stories. They're not parables about, like, truth and knowledge, really. They're much more about landlords and about taxes and about people's relationships to loans. And that was something that was never, ever brought up my entire upbringing in Christianity. I don't know why. Probably because there's a specific history of capital integration and to the church's power structure in the Middle Ages that also never got taught to me. Like, here's an interesting fact. The first multinational corporation ever. I didn't know what it was until recently, but it's technically the Knights Templar. There was a period of time in the Middle Ages where they were one of the largest landowners in all of Europe, which obviously, I didn't know that they were basically a non-governmental mercenary institutional organization, but, there's a lot of parallels between the Knights Templar and what America is doing with mercenary private military organizations in the Middle East right now. And to say that sounds like I'm, becoming Dan Brown is the shitty part. I can't actually say a claim like that and not immediately acknowledge that I've just been exposed to too much wackadoo narratives about, the Da Vinci Code or even National Treasure. Feels like I am on the path of that line of mania, which is boring. But I'm sorry. It's so hard not to ramble about all this. I've put so much of this in my head without structuring it. And the painting really brings out a free little flow of bullshit. So, let's see. The first check ever. I had never really considered it. I've read a lot of, economic theory, but I had never really read about the history of the check. The first check comes from the Crusades. It was invented by the Knights Templar as a way to repay the people who were paying the Knights Templar to go steal the relics from the Middle East. As, a kind of a leftist person, I think we often ignore the history of Christianity. Because, it's disgusting. And, on its face, it's obviously just an expansion of colonialism. But in that, there's a deeper ancient history that is so ignored, that involves basically the relationship of the Mediterranean to the East through the Silk Road. And in a larger sense, the first globalized systems of thought, which Christianity is amongst them. In a weird way. Everyone knows that, not everyone, but, there's a common notion that all of the Indo-European religions have a common source. This is pretty hard to debate at this point, and honestly is one of the more beautiful notions of history and ways to understand our reality I've ever stumbled across. And that's related to, Sanskrit and the Proto-Indo-European language being a common root for all languages. But I don't think the Abrahamic traditions are understood as kind of a historical neck point of when the old world meets the newer world. And we use those terms, again, colonially, the old world is Europe or something, and the new world is America. But what I mean is, the end of the Bronze Age and, the start of history in a modern sense. Again, fuck all these words, they're terrible. But really, it's hard to understand, gosh, here I am rambling again. Christianity really could be understood mostly as just a bridging of Greek and Aramaic religion. There's points of the Bible that are only philosophically significant because there is a bridging of grammatical structures. The I ams, the 7 I ams in the Gospel of John is a good example of this. You could not say I am in the way you could say it in Greek and Hebrew. So it's taking the notions from Judaism and basically transposing them into a Greek grammar. That's really what religious transformation is. Like, I really do think it is all a linguistic function. And that's why I meant to bring up the relationship of Sanskrit, because the more I've read the Gospel of Thomas, the more it really just seems like a Taoist text. And I know that, Taoism wasn't written in Sanskrit. I just mean to draw a further comparison to the notions of the East that were happening in their own classical period. But for instance, if you read the Dhammapada, which is the sayings of the Buddha, the first part of it is almost grammatically the exact same as the Gospel of John, in truly a bizarre way. And that's something I would love to have learned in church. But I think this history is either just not known or completely forgotten about. It's no mystery or secret that the Silk Road was operating during the classical era, 300, 400 BC. But all of the relationships that you could find amongst the literature in the East and in the West, it really makes for an interesting argument. In the Dhammapada, it starts out with something along the lines of, in the beginning, there was the thought, and God is a thought. As I recall, it's grammatically the same as how God is described in the Gospel of John using the Greek word logos, or the word, which I think is a bit of a bastardization of translation, but it's very hard to avoid that. Speaking of bastardizations in translations, the word Lord in the Bible we all got as kids is actually usually meant to translate the word Yahweh in Hebrew, which is an untranslatable word. And by that I mean the conception of Yahweh in Judaism is that it is a word that cannot be pronounced or understood by humans. And Yahweh itself is a kind of a derivation, even that's how it's understood in the Jewish scholarship. There's no way to actually say what Yahweh is implying. So in the Bible that we were given, this complicated Jewish notion of language, which their religion is much more about language than Christianity. Christianity is much more about agriculture and land relationships. And I think that's, again, a purely historical factor. But the word Lord really only has feudalistic implication, only has property. I don't have an adjective for property, but property relations implications. And I think that is bafflingly metaphysical for someone who was raised in dumb Southern Protestantism like myself. We have internalized a relationship to the land that is grammatically equating the Lord. See, I can't even get out of the word. But grammatically equating God with the owner of property, as though the earth is a property for God. And I think that in itself is the problem. In the Gospel of Thomas, it says that the kingdom of heaven is within everyone. However, in the Synoptic Gospels, it's pretty clear that the kingdom of heaven is something that is to come. I think that this also is related. Again, the main idea I have is that the Gospel of Thomas represents a truer form of whatever a blending and syncretism of religions was in the time of Jesus, which by that I mean a blending of Eastern religions, Greek notions of Platonic thought, Chinese notions of metaphysics, Indian notions of grammar, all of this coming together, again, where the Silk Road meets the Mediterranean Sea. it's very hard to get rid of environmental determinism in this type of thinking for me. I really think it's the best type of logical framework to work from. Um, sorry, I'm using my own language a little bit, but I just meant it's probably better to think of all of this in terms of its historical location and physical, literal location than in terms of actual what we think we can understand by the words. Because the more I'm trying to learn these ancient languages, at least a little bit, the more I'm realizing a lot of what we call definition is legitimately historical obfuscation. There's no other way to put it. Suppose that'd be a good place for a break.